and June Kim, the two lead attorneys who were designated as special deputies to the Attorney General's office to announce the findings of their investigation into allegations of sexual harassment made against Governor Andrew Cuomo. I'll make a brief statement and then turn it over to Ms. Clark and to Mr. Kim, who will delve into the investigation's findings. The independent investigation has concluded that Governor Andrew Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women and in doing so violated federal and state law. Specifically, the investigation found that Governor Andrew Cuomo sexually harassed current and former New York State employees by engaging in unwelcome and non-consensual touching and making numerous offensive comments of a suggestive and sexual nature that created a hostile work environment for women. The investigators independently corroborated and substantiated these facts through interviews and evidence, including contemporaneous notes and communications. This evidence will be made available to the public along with the report. This investigation was started after a number of women publicly alleged that they had been sexually harassed by Governor Cuomo. And on March 1st of this year, the governor's office made a referral to my office pursuant to State Executive Law 63-8 regarding these allegations. Executive Law Section 63-8 permits the New York Attorney General's office, with the approval of the governor, or when directed by the governor, to inquire into matters concerning the public peace, the public safety, and public justice. This referral issued by the governor enabled my office to appoint independent outside investigators to look into these allegations. And on March 8th, 2021, Ann Clark and June Kim, they were officially deputized as special deputies. Ms. Clark and Mr. Kim and their respective firms were chosen to lead this investigation because of their decades of work at the highest levels, their deep expertise on matters in question, and their careers fighting to uphold the rule of law. Ann Clark is a partner at Vladnick, Raskin & Clark PC, where she focuses on employment law issues on behalf of employees at the trial and appellate levels. And during her more than 30-year career, Ms. Clark has represented clients in a variety of employment, sexual harassment, and other discrimination cases in the private sector, in education, and in government. She also has deep experience with retaliation, whistleblower, breach of contract, and compensation and benefit cases. June Kim is a partner at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, LLP. And for more than 2 decades, he has worked at the highest levels of government and in private practice. From March 2017 to January 2018, he served as the acting United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. As the most senior federal law enforcement officer in the district, he oversaw all criminal and civil litigation conducted on behalf of the United States. Before becoming acting United States Attorney, Mr. Kim served in various leadership positions in the office, including Deputy United States Attorney, Chief of the Criminal Division, and Chief Counsel to the United States Attorney. Ms. Clark and Mr. Kim are experienced, credible, and deeply respected professionals. And together, they ensured that this investigation was both independent and thorough. Over the course of the 5-month investigation, the investigators spoke to 179 individuals, including complainants, current and former members of the executive chamber, state troopers, additional state employees, and others who interacted regularly with the governor. In addition, they reviewed more than 74,000 pieces of evidence, including documents, emails, texts, audio files, and pictures. These interviews and pieces of evidence reveal a deeply disturbing yet clear picture. Governor Cuomo sexually harassed current and former state employees in violation of both federal and state laws. The independent investigation found that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, many of whom were young women, by engaging in unwanted groping, kisses, hugging, and by making inappropriate comments. Further, the governor and his senior team took actions to retaliate against at least one former employee for coming forward with her story, her truth. And Governor Cuomo's administration fostered a toxic workplace that enabled harassment and created a hostile work environment where staffers did not feel comfortable coming forward with complaints about sexual harassment due to a climate of fear and given the power dynamics. The investigators found that Governor Cuomo's actions and those of the executive chamber violated multiple state and federal laws, as well as the executive chamber's own written policies. This investigation has revealed conduct that corrodes the very fabric and character of our state government and shines light on injustice that can be present at the highest levels of government. But none of this would have been illuminated if not for the heroic women who came forward. And I am inspired by all the brave women who came forward. But more importantly, I believe them. And I thank them for their bravery. And I thank the independent investigators for their professionalism, despite the attacks, and for their dogged determination that brought us to the truth. And now we will hear from June Kim and Ann Clark, who will walk us through the report and their findings.
Thank you, Attorney General James. Good morning. My name is June Kim, and along with my colleague, Ann Clark, we have led our teams at our two law firms in conducting the investigation into allegations of sexual harassment by Governor Cuomo. We have now completed our investigation and have made our findings and reached our conclusions. They're set forth in a detailed report issued today. As set forth in the report, we find that the governor, on numerous occasions, engaged in conduct that constitutes unlawful sex-based harassment. Specifically, we find that the governor sexually harassed a number of current and former New York State employees. He did so by, among other things, engaging in unwelcome and non-consensual touching, and also repeatedly making comments of a sexualized or gender-based nature. Our investigation revealed that these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. The governor's pattern of sexually harassing behavior was not limited to members of his own staff, but extended to other state employees, including a state trooper who served on his protective detail. There are 11 complainants whose allegations are set forth in great detail in the report. 9 of them are or were employed by the state of New York or a state-affiliated entity. The complainants interacted with the governor under different circumstances. For example, some of them met with him regularly as an executive assistant or as members of his staff, or as I said, as a trooper on his protective detail, while others only met him once. But all of them experienced harassing conduct from the governor. Some suffered through unwanted touching and grabbing of their most intimate body parts. Others suffered through repeated, offensive, sexually suggestive, or gender-based comments. A number of them endured both. None of them welcomed it, and all of them found it disturbing, humiliating, uncomfortable, and inappropriate. And now we find that it was unlawful sex-based harassment. Our investigation has also found that the executive chamber responded to allegations of sexual harassment in ways that violated their own internal policies and also constituted unlawful retaliation with respect to one of the complainants. And finally, based on our investigation, we concluded that the executive chamber's workplace culture, one rife with bullying, fear, and intimidation on the one hand, while normalizing frequent flirtations and gender-based comments by the governor on the other, created the conditions that allowed the sexual harassment and retaliation to occur and to persist. As the Attorney General has said, we reached these findings and conclusions after a thorough and independent investigation. We were allowed to and did follow the facts without fear, without favor. As you will see in the report, our findings are supported by extensive evidence that includes interviews and testimony from 179 witnesses and review of tens of thousands of documents. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Ann Clark to walk through some of the specifics related to the sexual harassment, the policy violations, and the retaliation.
We find that the governor on many occasions engaged in sex-based harassing conduct and conversations. The most serious was the governor's unwelcome physical contact with women, including touching intimate body parts. He engaged in this conduct with state employees, including those who didn't work in the executive chamber, as well as non-employees. One current employee, who we identify as Executive Assistant Number 1, endured repeated physical violations. On November 16, 2020, in the Executive Mansion, the governor hugged Executive Assistant Number 1 and reached under her blouse to grab her breast. This was the culmination of a pattern of inappropriate sexual conduct, including numerous close and intimate hugs, where the governor held her so closely that her breasts were pressed against his body, and he sometimes ran his hands up and down her back while he did so. There were also several occasions on which the governor grabbed her butt. Executive Assistant Number 1 had vowed that she was going to take these violations, as she put it, to the grave. She was terrified that if she spoke out, she would lose her job. But she broke down in front of colleagues when she heard the governor on March 3, 2021, in his press conference claim that he had never touched anyone inappropriately. She then confided in her coworkers who saw her break down as to what had happened, and they were the ones that reported the conduct to attorneys in the executive chamber. The governor also several times inappropriately touched a state trooper assigned to the unit to protect the governor. In an elevator, while standing behind the trooper, he ran his finger from her neck down her spine and said, "Hey, you." Another time, she was standing holding the door open for the governor. As he passed, he took his open hand and ran it across her stomach from her belly button to the hip where she keeps her gun. She told us that she felt completely violated to have the governor touch her, as she put it, between her chest and her privates. The governor also inappropriately touched women who were attending work-related events at which the governor made remarks. At one event in September 2019, while having his picture taken with an employee of a state entity, the governor grabbed this young woman's butt. At another event in May of 2017, the governor pressed and ran his fingers across the chest of a woman while reading the name of her company, whose logo was on her chest. The governor also engaged in a widespread pattern of subjecting women to unwanted hugs and kisses and touching them in ways that made them uncomfortable. Conduct that is not just old-fashioned, affectionate behavior, as he and some of his staff members would have it, but unlawful sex-based harassment. In addition to the physical conduct, our investigation found that the governor regularly made comments to staff members and state employees that were offensive and gender-based. For example, the governor crossed the line many times when speaking with Charlotte Bennett, a briefer and executive assistant, particularly in spring of 2020. When she confided in the governor that she had been sexually assaulted in college, he asked her for the details of her assault. When talking about potential girlfriends, he said he thought he could date women as young as 22, knowing that Miss Bennett was 25 at the time. He asked her whether she had ever been with older men. He told her that he was lonely and wanted to be touched. He asked her if she was monogamous and what she thought about monogamy. He speculated on how her history as a sexual assault survivor might affect her romantic life. He told her that she looked like Daisy Duke. He suggested that she get a tattoo she was contemplating on her butt and asked her if she had any piercings anywhere other than her ears. Miss Bennett texted to a friend on the day where many of these comments were made that she was upset and confused and that she was shaking. Another example is the governor's comments to the state trooper, the same trooper he touched on the stomach and back. After the governor had become single, he asked the trooper how old she was. When she responded that she was in her late 20s, he said, "That's too old for him." He then asked her how much of an age difference he thought he could have between him and a girlfriend and have the public still accept it. She suggested it might be a good idea to stick with women at least as old as your daughters. She then tried to deflect the conversation by asking the governor what he was looking for in a girlfriend. He responded that he was looking for somebody who could handle pain. Another time, when the governor found out that the trooper was engaged, he asked her why she'd want to get married because, among other things, your sex drive goes down. As detailed in the report, employees recounted a pattern of similarly offensive comments and conversations, such as the governor repeatedly asking Executive Assistant Number 1 whether she would cheat on her husband, saying to her, "If you were single, the things I would do to you," telling her that she looked great for her age, which was early 30s, and for a mother, calling her and coworker Alyssa McGrath mingle mamas, comparing Lindsay Boylan to a more attractive version of one of his ex-girlfriends and to actresses. Women also described to us having the governor seek them out, stare intently at them, look them up and down, or gaze at their chest or butt. In sum, the governor routinely interacted with women in ways that focused on their gender, sometimes in explicitly sexualized manner, in ways that women found deeply humiliating and offensive. Both federal and state law prohibit gender-based harassment in the workplace. In fact, the governor himself, in August of 2019, passed a law that eliminated in New York State the requirement that harassing conduct needed to be severe or pervasive. In New York, a woman need only show that she was treated less well, at least in part, because of her gender. The governor's conduct, detailed in the report, clearly meets and far exceeds this standard. We also find that the executive chamber failed to follow its own harassment policies and procedures, ones that on paper are consistent with New York legal requirements. This was exemplified by the handling of Charlotte Bennett's complaint. In June of 2020, Ms. Bennett told the governor's chief of staff about recent conversations of a sexual nature that were so uncomfortable that she no longer wanted to interact with the governor. The chief of staff relayed Ms. Bennett's complaints to others in the governor's inner circle and transferred Ms. Bennett within days. 2 weeks later, the chief of staff and a special counsel spoke with Ms. Bennett, who detailed interactions with the governor that went back to May of 2019. The Chief of Staff and Special Counsel both found Ms. Bennett to be credible. The Chief of Staff consulted with the Special Counsel and with Melissa DeRosa, the Secretary to the Governor, and they decided they did not need to report this to the Governor's Office of Employee Relations, GOER, or conduct any meaningful investigation. They simply moved Ms. Bennett and instituted a policy of not having a junior staffer be alone with the governor. And even that, they said, was to protect the governor. That response, we find, was a violation of the Executive Chamber's harassment policy, which clearly requires that all possible harassment be reported to GOER and investigated. Now, 6 months later, in December of 2020, when Lindsey Boylan tweeted that she had been sexually harassed by the governor, the Executive Chamber once again failed to report the issue to GOER. Although Ms. DeRosa, the Special Counsel, and certain other advisors knew about the allegations that Charlotte Bennett had made that the Special Counsel had found credible, no one treated Ms. Boylan's allegations seriously other than as a threat to the governor. Rather than any effort to determine if the governor had engaged in a pattern of sexually harassing behavior, a team of senior staffers, former staffers, and outside confidants with no official title or role mobilized to attack and try to neutralize Ms. Boylan by sharing disparaging information with the press. Within hours of Ms. Boylan's December 13, 2020 tweet alleging sexual harassment, key members of the governor's inner circle had obtained confidential memos, ones that were stamped attorney-client privileged. They were primarily about an interaction between Ms. Boylan and an assistant. They then redacted the names of individuals other than Ms. Boylan and started sending the memos to reporters. There was also a proposed letter or op-ed drafted by the governor that went through several drafts. The letter attacked Ms. Boylan for alleged conduct at work, for alleged conduct with men other than the governor, as well as postulating various political conspiracies, including that Ms. Boylan was funded by far-right Republicans and supporters of Donald Trump. Although the letter was never published, it was sent or read to a variety of people outside the executive chamber, either to get their advice or ask them to sign their names to it, and shared ultimately with at least one member of the press. The governor was arguing for the release of that letter. He was finally convinced to abandon it by a number of people who thought the letter was a bad idea, in part because what was in the letter couldn't be substantiated and because they thought that victim shaming would be bad as a strategy. Both federal and state law prohibit an employer from taking any action that would dissuade a reasonable employee or former employee from making or supporting a charge of discrimination. Under that standard, the confidential release of internal records to the press and the dissemination of the letter disparaging Ms. Boylan constituted unlawful retaliation. I will now turn it back to Mr. Kim to say a few words about our findings with respect to the workplace culture within the executive chamber.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. As set forth in our report, we find that the culture within the executive chamber contributed to the conditions that allowed the governor's sexually harassing conduct to occur and to persist. The culture also informed the way in which the executive chamber responded to allegations of sexual harassment, as Ms. Clark has described, through violations of their own policies and through unlawful retaliation. Well, what was the culture? Words that witnesses have used repeatedly to describe it include toxic, hostile, abusive. Others use words like fear, intimidation, bullying, vindictive. As one senior staffer stated bluntly, as the sexual harassment allegations became public,
you just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.